So today we are taking a look at the quadratic formula, very important formula that we use quite a bit throughout algebra 2, pre-calc, super helpful. And it's a different way to solve a quadratic equation. So for instance, in number 1, it says we're going to solve the following quadratic equation for all values of x by completing the square. So that's one option, is you could solve this by completing the square. And we're going to just review completing the square. So very first thing that you would want to do in completing the square would be, I like to bring over the constant. Okay, so now we have x squared minus 6x is equal to -1. Now remember, when you are completing the square, I always think I need to add something to one side and I have to add that same value to the other. So I just kind of give myself little boxes to fill in. Okay. Now, when we find that term to add, we take the middle term, which is -6. We say half of -6, that's going to get us a -3. And then we take that -3 and we square that, and that gives us a +9. So that's what we add to both sides, is a +9. Okay, now we go and we make the factor. The factor, we said we could always make it super quick and easy by taking whatever half of that middle term was, which was a -3, and squaring that. Okay. On the other side, we are going to combine the -1 and the 9. And so the -1 and the 9, we get 8. Okay, so from here we need to solve for x. So just like we had in our last unit, I have to get rid of that square. I want to get to the x. So if I square root a square, they're inverse operations, they cancel each other out. And now I will be left with just that x minus 3 squared on the one side. And on the other side now, because remember, I've introduced the square root, you get two values. You get both a positive and a negative square root of 8. Okay, so from here, I'm sorry. I have a mistake here because we squared the square root, the square goes away. So from here, we just have x minus 3, which means actually we don't even need these parentheses here. And we're just solving for x. So if I solve for x, all I'm going to do is add over the 3. And now we've found our value of x. So we have x is equal to 3 plus and minus square root of 8. So we have found two answers. All right, you could write them together like that. You could write them separately. 3 plus the square root of 8, that's one answer. And then you would also have 3 minus the square root of 8 would be another answer. Okay, so that's one way to solve a quadratic equation. Quadratic formula, you could use for any quadratic equation. Okay, so some people don't like completing the square, and you're really good at memorizing formulas, which is something you would have to memorize. If you know that, then you can do this quadratic formula and solve it, no worries about completing the square. So the thing that we have to remember is which term is our A, our B, and our C. And then from there, we can plug it into the formula and solve. So we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve that same equation. So I'm just going to rewrite this equation so we have it. So we have x squared minus 6x plus 1 equals 0. So with that, we can identify our A, our B, and our C. Okay, so if I'm looking at this, I can see A is equal to +1, B is equal to -6, and C is equal to +1. So now we have our terms all situated. We're just going to plug them into the formula. Okay, so we're going to start off with x equals, now we have a -b, so I have a -6. We have plus and minus, because remember, we got two answers up above. Square root of b squared, so be careful, that's a negative. I want to square the whole term, -6. And now I have minus 4 times a times c. And now this whole entire thing gets divided by 2 times a. And now it's a matter of just simplifying. Okay, so I'm going to do this step at a time. A -6, that's a +6. We get plus and minus. square root of, so now I have negative 6 squared, that's 36. I have minus 4 times 1, so minus 4. And then all over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, we simplify under the square root next, just following our orders of operations. So that is now 6 plus and minus the square root of 32 over 2. Okay, so now it says we have to state this in simplest radical form, meaning we have to simplify that square root. So I have to find two numbers that multiply to be 32 where one is a perfect square. And those two values are going to be the square root of 16, that's your perfect square, times the square root of 2. So 16 times 2 gets you 32. 16 is your perfect square. And because 16 is your perfect square, when you start to simplify, if I take the square root of 16, we know that's 4 square roots of 2 all over 2. Okay, so we've simplified the square root. Now we need to be able to reduce the fraction. So we can reduce the fraction because I see on the denominator, I have a 2. And in the numerator, I have both a 6 and a 4. And this 2 can evenly be divided into each of those terms evenly. So 2 goes into 2 once, 2 goes into 6 3 times, and 2 goes into 4 twice. Okay, now we're just going to simplify this. I have 3 plus and minus 2 radical 2, and it's all over 1, so I don't need to write that. This would be my final answer. We're going to try another one. So we have, here's our formula again. Okay, using the quadratic formula, we're going to solve this equation. And again, we're going to do this in simplest radical form. So I always like to situate what my A, my B, and my C terms are so that I have it all set ready to go. So I see A is going to be 1, B is negative 10, and C is 20. Okay, so we start this off, and don't forget this x equals. That's always a part that people just kind of forget. Don't do that. You need that to have an equation. So we have here negative b, so negative 10. We have plus and minus the square root of b squared, so I have negative 10 squared, minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. We start to simplify. Okay, so negative 10, again, we get a positive 10. Negative 10 squared is 100. I have 4 times 1 times 20. So that's going to be a negative 80 all over 2. Okay, so next we're going to simplify under the radical. So I have 10 plus and minus radical, 100 minus 80, I get 20 all over 2. So now again, we're in that simplest radical form, meaning I have to reduce that square root. So I have to find two numbers that multiply to be 20 where one is a perfect square. And I know that that can break up into the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. Square root of 4 is our perfect square, and that's going to simplify down to 2. Okay, and then our last step is to try and reduce. And again, I check my denominator and I see, can that be divided into both the number in front of the plus and minus and the number next to the radical, and it can. So 2 goes into 2 once, 2 goes into 10 5 times, 2 goes into 2 once. Okay, so our final answer here, ooh, I wrote that as a 10, didn't I? That shouldn't be 10, that should be an X. Let's try that again. Okay, so final answer that we have here is X is equal to 5 plus and minus radical 5. Simplest form, that is reduced, that is equivalent to this. You could also check that on your calculator and make sure, all right? So if you plug in the thing on the left and the thing on the right, should get you the same answer. And that's just a good check. Keep in mind, you have two answers. So you'd want to plug this in kind of like we had on that first example. If you're checking this, you would need to do 5 plus radical 5, get a decimal value. Over here on your calculator, you would have to do 10 plus radical 20 over 2 and make sure that those balance out. Okay, that's how you would kind of check something like this. Okay, so quadratic formula is helpful when a quadratic expression is prime or not factorable. So, but it can be used as a replacement for that zero product law in cases where it can be factored. So in other words, I could take a problem and I could factor it. I could take a problem and I could do the quadratic equation. You could do either. Both of these are used in solving quadratic formulas or quadratic equations. It's a preference. So unless it specifically says, like it does here, that you have to use one method over another, it's kind of your choice. So we're going to solve this first one by factoring. And so looking at this first one, I see it has a coefficient of 2. So that tells me we need to do that harder trinomial factoring, meaning I have to find something that's going to multiply to be negative 12, 2 times that negative 6, but it has to add to be our middle term, which is 11. Okay, and so factors that work here would be 12 and 1. And the sign of the middle term goes with our larger factor, which is 12. So that means 1 has to be negative in order to both add to be 11 and multiply to be negative 12. Okay, so we're going to copy our first term. We're going to split that middle term up into a positive 12x and a negative 1x. We have our minus 6 equals 0. Okay, so now we need to factor by grouping. Okay, so out of our first term, I can factor out both a 2 and an x, leaving me with x plus 6. And our second term, I can factor out a negative 1, which would leave me with x plus 6. So that's good because those have to check out. And now we are going to rewrite our factors. So I can see x plus 6 is a common term. And then I gather my other two, I have 2x minus 1. Okay, and if we were to solve, at this point, we set each of these equal to 0, and we solve for x. So I can see here x should equal negative 6, and on this side, if we solve, x would equal 1/2. So these would be our two answers, and we solved that by factoring. So that's something that we've done. Okay, but we can also do this by the quadratic formula. Okay, so we start off by saying identify our A term and our B term and our C term. So our A value is 2, our B value is 11, and our C value is negative 6. And then we plug it into the formula. Okay, so we have x is equal to negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. And now we're going to simplify. Okay, just remember orders of operations, just be careful, step at a time. So I have plus and minus. Underneath, I have here the square root of 11 squared is 121. And now I have to multiply the 4 times the 2, which is 8. 8 times negative 6. So watch your signs here, right? Because I had a negative here and a negative. So that's going to make that a positive. Okay. And then we have 8 times 6, and that's getting us 48. And divide that by 4. 2 times 2 gets you 4. Okay, so we keep simplifying. So now I have a positive 121 and a positive 48, and that's going to get us, when we add this up, a positive 169. And now that's nice because that's a perfect square. So that simplifies down. I don't have to do any splitting of it. That is already 13. When you take the square root of 169, you get 13. And then to get our two answers to look the same, remember, here's what we have. I have one value that's negative 11 plus 13 over 4. And then the other value I have is negative 11 minus 13 over 4. Okay, so negative 11 plus 13, that's getting you 2. 2 divided by 4, well, there's your 1/2 that we found from earlier. And then over here, if I have negative 11 and a negative 13, That's going to get us a negative 24, and a negative 24 divided by 4 gets you a negative 6. So you can see you get the same answers. So that's kind of nice if you didn't want to factor, you don't remember how to factor, you have this formula, and that is a great way to solve some problems. Okay. We are going to try one more problem here. And it says we're going to solve each of the following quadratic equations by using the quadratic formula. Some answers will be purely rational numbers, and some will involve irrational numbers, and we're going to place all in simplest form. Irrational numbers, remember, those are your square roots that we have to simplify. All right, so we're going to just do letter B. I'm going to save the other 3 for practice. We're going to do letter B, and we're going to start off again by identifying our A value, which is 1, our B value, which is negative 8, and our C value, which is 13. Okay, so looking at our formula, we have X is equal to negative B plus and minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C all over 2A. Okay, so negative, negative 8, that gets you a positive 8, plus and minus. Negative 8 squared is a positive 64, okay? Negative 4 times 1, we get a 4, and then 4 times, sorry, that should be a negative 4. Negative 4 times 1, you get a negative 4. Negative 4 times 13 should get us 52. And now we still have on the bottom divided by 2. Right, and we're going to simplify again. So I have 8 plus and minus. Now if I do 64 minus 52, I should get 12 divided by 2. And so now again, we're at that spot where I have to simplify the radical. So I have to find 2 numbers that multiply to be 12, where 1 is a perfect square. So that's going to be 4 and 3. And 4 being your perfect square, that's going to simplify down to 2 radical 3 over 2. Sorry, I'm running out of room. And now again, we want to check. 2 can go into each of those numbers, 8 and 2. So 2 goes into 2 once, 2 goes into 8 4 times, 2 goes into 2 once. So our final answer that we're going to have on this one is 4 plus and minus radical 3. Okay. We will try the other questions. You can also try those other questions and see how you do. And then if you have questions, bring them to class and we'll go through them. Okay. Hope you guys had a great day, and we'll talk to you later.